Howdy, all you delicious people. This is yet another disaster movie. We really have it to where reasonably this film honestly is yet another one of those comet like asteroid things hitting the earth, uh, or meteors or whatever you want to call them, little portions of rock that are seemingly hitting all up and down the earth. So going into this movie, I thought this movie was okay. Like I thought that this, like when looking at it, I've probably seen other more interesting kind of asteroid-esh like movies. Like it's not Gerard Butler having to fly a ship out to the comet to detonate some nuclear warhead on it. No, it's not anything like that. It's not Gerard Butler having to save the planet or whatever from this asteroid attack. No. Uh, Ultimately, it's just like, hey, stuff is hitting the fan, people getting away from it or flying to some location to where it could quite possibly not affect them, and so on and so forth, to ultimately get to an underground establishment to feel safe, is ultimately um, the crux here. We really have it to where I've kind of seen quite a few of these, like, kind of comet, asteroid, whatever movie kind of things where there's some kind of deep impact or whatever. Uh, there's been so many other movies. I think Elijah Wood was probably in one of them at some point. I think Morgan Freeman, I think, was in probably the same movie as a president, probably. Uh, I'm kind of pulling at a lot of strings here to probably see what falls. Ultimately, if probably anybody wants to go through and IMDb any of those people and see which one it is, because I don't want to say the wrong name of something. Because I'm assuming it's going to be like something like Deep Impact or Mercury Rising or some, I don't know, some weird ash title, and Mercury Rising doesn't even sound good to me. I think Deep Impact sounds a little bit better, but ultimately that just might be an action movie at some point. So there was a couple that all like came right about the same year that Elijah Wood was doing his uh, Impact movie, whatever it was called, with probably Morgan Freeman and any number of people. So going into this movie, like I kind of can feel that this movie kind of does have a lot of realism to it. I guess that could be the upside to this movie. Is I feel that there is a lot of desperation with people, and that's what kind of makes this movie interesting. We have it to where like people are starting to look at certain people and they're like, licking their chops and like, you know what? I think I want that guy. Like it kind of quickly like turns into that kind of movie where people are in just such desperation that ultimately they are going to try to justify any number of things, even if it doesn't quite make sense, even if it'll be a waste of time to attempt. So I just thought that there was some portions of desperation in this movie which I thought were interesting, but other than that, this movie kind of slowly trickles itself out because it has to. Like it has to be that kind of movie where everyone is just scrambling to get out of somewhere. Like when looking at it, every single one of these kinds of movies has this same kind of approach. Like if you ever watched the Netflix movie The Silence, where you ultimately have it to where seemingly people are going to be trying to drive as quickly as humanly possible to get away from certain cities that ultimately have these monsters seemingly all over the place. Um, but then they ultimately find out that they ultimately need to be quiet to ultimately have the quietest thing to be able to live longer. And so, interestingly enough. So, I thought that, yeah, this movie just gets a big old okay in my marker. Because I've kind of seen too many of disaster movies. I've seen too many kind of approaches of this going at this well. And so, where can you exactly see this movie before I get into spoilers? Well, ultimately, there is a $5.99 fee or whatever. There's some kind of rental fee for most places. Ultimately, you can go into Movie Pro and probably see this for absolutely free, or you could also go into probably some movie app like thing and ultimately see this for free, uh, conveniently. You probably check out a TV Crush or ultimately a movie play box or a movie box of sorts, and ultimately try your luck there. Like it's getting to be like a shorter and shorter list for all these things to work at this point, and so ultimately, eventually just kind of start like experimenting and see what you find at some point. So, let's get into the spoilers about this movie because at the end of the day, I would say that this movie is fairly simple. Like, there's not an extravagant thing going on. Like, it's not 2012 where you're seeing like a guy like flying a plane and everything behind him is falling to the ground, and like there's this huge, like gigantic, uh, bizarre contraption that everybody's going into to hide from. Man, I should probably just review 2012. Because ultimately, man, is that movie just extravagant. Just, man, like, you have it to where, like, people are just driving off in a limo as quickly as humanly possible at the fastest speed that they can possibly have it, and the world is just falling down around them. It's freaking awesome. But ultimately, that also is a really complicated movie. There's several stuff to explain in that review. So, like I said, let's get into that double five time territory. Yeah, I would just say that this movie, go out of your way to watch it if you can watch it for free. Meaning, like, if you go into the movie apps that I suggested and watch it for free, you can probably see whether or not it's worth buying or renting or whatever. Um, but I'm not going to highly suggest people go out of their way to watch this movie, especially if you've kind of seen other kind of movies that ultimately have been in past kind of comet like movies. Check out the Elijah Wood, whatever that movie is. Check out that one. That one's actually pretty probably old, and you should probably find it maybe somewhere easily for free. Maybe, I don't know. Just go into Elijah Wood's just Rolodex and just figure it out. I don't know. I don't remember what that movie is called. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, we ultimately have it to where in the beginning of this movie, spoilers now, we ultimately have it to where seemingly uh, John, I'll just say, I don't want to even try to pronounce the last name. John, who is Gerard Butler's character, who has, of course, the most common name you've ever heard of in your life. We ultimately have Allison, who is, of course, the girl from Deadpool, and, of course, also the girl from Gotham as well, if a lot of people know Gotham. So we ultimately have John and Allison, who seemingly have a bump in the road in their relationship, I would say. There is a awkward amount of times where ultimately they have to be a family, but ultimately we have it to where John is mentioning how awkward it is between them. We ultimately have it to where John is trying to spend time with Nathan, which is, of course, their son, and ultimately they're trying to figure out like what's kind of going on in their relationship because John and Allison's relationship is quote unquote on the rocks. So, and we'll explain why later, I hope, at some point, because it should probably be an important thing that I hopefully bring up, but I might completely and utterly forget about it. So, we ultimately have it to where they're going through common day-to-day stuff, we end up having it to where Allison and Nathan end up leaving, and while they end up leaving, or no wait, uh, while John and Nathan, I believe, end up leaving, and Allison is ultimately kind of cleaning a house and doing some common day to day things. We eventually have John getting a kind of an ambient alert or whatever the emergency alert system ultimately is to tell him that he and his son and wife are to uh, are to go to this safety bunker. We end up having it to where John ultimately asks Allison about this, like, "Hey, like, did you get an ambulance alert, emergency alert about us needing to go somewhere? Like, I don't understand what's going on." And so we ultimately have it to where seemingly John and Allison are throwing a party with their neighbors, and we ultimately have this ambient this emergency alert go onto John's phone and ultimately his TV yet again. We ultimately seemingly find out that there is a comet that is getting far too close to the Earth compared to normal, and so ultimately we have it to where seemingly we have it to where everybody's starting to get worried and concerned about this emergency thing going on. So ultimately, we have it to where John finally checks it out onto his phone and realizes there's some barcode that ultimately he has to go somewhere and get scanned out. So that way he can be separated between everybody. So we end up having it to where ultimately the rest of his neighbors are like, well, hey, I haven't gotten an emergency alert on my phone, or hey, I haven't gotten a emergency alert on my TV. Like, maybe we should go home right now and ultimately see if we're going to get one. So we have it to where all his neighbors start to scatter, just kind of worried about what's all going on. And so we ultimately have it to where John and Allison and Nathaniel end up packing for their supplies. Like, not knowing exactly how long they're going to need any of their stuff for. So they're like, what do I grab? I don't know. So we end up having them scrambling for all kinds of items. And so ultimately we have it to where they are to go and drive to this location. And before they end up driving off, we end up having one of her neighbors desperately asking, take my son with you." Or take my kid with you, whatever gender it is, I don't know. We end up having it to where John ultimately says we can't just take any kid with us. Ultimately, there's only ability to take John, Allison, and Nathaniel, and that's it. That's all they can take. Ultimately, like, this kid will get as far as the border and then no further. Because ultimately, you can't just take anybody with you and just declare that they're yours. It doesn't work that way. It's a numbers thing. So ultimately, we have it to where this neighbor is crying and is like, just take my kid. And ultimately, Gerard Butler's character is like, no, I can't take your kid. I wish I could, but I can't. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be a D right now. I don't mean to be a dirtbag, but when looking at it, I cannot take your son. What a horrible moment that was. But when looking at it, Gerard Butler was justified in, like, I'm not going to get held up by someone that I cannot take. I am not going to, like, if it's my life or this kid, I'm going to be choosing my life. I'm sorry. It's, like, and that's sad. But that is to where it, like, escalates the whole situation, and that's what makes this, like, this movie really interesting at this part, where ultimately Gerard Butler is like, dude, like, it's my family, I can't take anybody. Like, I'm a cold-hearted mother right now, and I'm sorry. So we have them drive on, and we end up finding out that they're getting scanned by a military officer, and they end up going on into to be checked and everything like that. And we eventually realize that John ultimately realizes that because they have to put like every single thing, like they have to put like 3 bags of stuff all in one smaller bag, and they eventually noticed that they had completely forgotten Nathan's insulin. So John has to confirm with like 8 different people, which I can completely understand that. We end up having it to where John is confirming with 8 different people before he gets back to his car that he has to go and get something for his son, and he will be right back. He has the hand like handband and everything. He's asking everybody like, "Hey, I can make sure I can get back here, right?" And they're saying, "Yes, go ahead." We end up having it to where ultimately Allison and Nathan are in there, and they are asking about their husband. It's like, hey, are all the planes that we're gonna go all gonna go to the same place? Because like I need to know, because if me and my husband get separated, because ultimately my husband had went back for my son's insulin, and we ended up having it where the military official is ultimately saying, "Oh, well, your son has insulin, he can't go." Mother, really? Wow, what a stab in the back. So we end up finding out that this kid can't go because if he has an insulin problem, ultimately, like they won't know if they'll be able to take care of this kid while he's underground or whatever the heck that they are going to be at. And I am like, wow, this is crazy. This is crazy. So we end up having to where Allison and Nathan end up just leaving. Because ultimately, if they can't take their son, then they basically aren't going to go. Where John goes all the way up into a plane and then has to go all the way back out of the plane because Allison and Nathan can't quite possibly go. We ultimately have it to where John basically stops this plane from going off so that way he can ultimately go and grab his wife and son. We end up finding out that their phones, bizarrely, are barely usable. We end up having it to where John tries to text her and texts aren't being delivered and all kinds of things. We ultimately find out that Allison and Nathan end up going into a person's vehicle, and we end up finding out that seemingly that Allison calls Jonathan when Jonathan eventually gets out of off the plane, and they're just to say like, oh, okay, well, if our son can't go, then let's try to get as in another different state to get to somewhere as humanly possible. We ultimately end up having John saying like, okay, well, let's travel to Allison's father's ranch or his barn or whatever the heck that he has. So we end up having it to where Allison ends up going and ultimately trying in desperation to like talk to these 2 people that ultimately, it seems like at first that they're really fine and nice people. We ultimately seemingly have it to where this wife and this husband ultimately are seemingly like really nice people. It seems that ultimately we had it to where Allison had gone to the pharmacy and for Nathan's insulin and found those people. And so they drive off. Eventually we find it that, so we end up having it to where seemingly this husband ends up kicking Allison out of the car to ultimately just say, hey, we're going to take your son and like be able to get him to be able to be like safe. We're going to basically use him to basically get us on a plane to ultimately have it to where this son is basically going to get us on this plane because he's going to be chosen, but this husband is not, or this family is not. So they're going to use this son to forcibly get on a plane, which ultimately they do not do because the son confesses that ultimately these people aren't really his parents and they just kidnapped him. So eventually we have it to where Allison eventually hitchhikes her way to ultimately reconnecting with her son and ultimately reconnecting to make it to the way of which that she needs to go. We eventually have it to where John is ultimately on a filming it way to get to where he needs to. We end up having it to where seemingly he is in a he's in the back of a truck, and so we end up having a number of guys just kind of asking a little bit of questions about John, ultimately asking a little bit more about kind of showcasing his backstory, then also seeing how desperate people are. So we seemingly have it toward John ultimately is a architect or a builder of sorts, and we end up having it to where, oh, okay, so I guess in the future, if every single building ends up getting demolished or whatever, then ultimately a rebuilder of buildings needs to be a person to be a part of the future. Because ultimately, with the whole destruction and annihilation of basically Earth everywhere, like, yeah, it would be good to have this guy here. So we end up having it to where ultimately we get backstory of who John really is and why he's important to being chosen. And we eventually have some other guy that I've seen in the Netflix movie Babysitter, and he is talking it out with John to just kind of get more backstory and also get backstory on this guy to just be like, oh, okay, well, he's going to be the nice guy, where it seems like other people on the truck are looking at this guy's like wristband thing and ultimately seeing it as a way to get out of here, to be safe. And so ultimately we have like some people ultimately wanting to basically just uh, kill John. Like they're looking, their lips looking at this guy and just be like, he has a hall pass, I don't, so he's gonna be dead. We ultimately have to where one of the guys asks for John's wallet and all kinds of other stuff, and they end up getting in a fight, but ultimately John gets out of this unscathed. So, pushing on. So, we eventually have it to where ultimately John, Allison, and Nathan are all to meet up uh, at Dale's home, which is ultimately Allison's uh, father. So, we end up having it where ultimately it seems that they aren't exactly going to be safe at Dale's home, but it's just kind of like a means to an end to reconnect with another at a different location that is going to be much more safe, supposedly for the meantime. And so ultimately we have it to where Dale and John eventually break into like helping us figure out what had really happened with this relationship, saying that the relationship was on the rocks, and ultimately John had been thrusted into the arms of another woman, and ultimately that's where everything went horribly awry. But it seems that having it just simply be the end of the world is going to bring these people back together because they do realize how much they actually really do love one another when basically death is on the line, or when death is near and dear to being on its way, let's just say. So, we ultimately have it to where John is mentioning that he will do whatever he needs to keep Nathaniel and Allison safe. And so it seems that eventually we have it to where it seems that ultimately John is asking Dale for him to come along to ultimately see if they can get him to a safe location. And Dale ultimately says no. Like I have lived here with my wife for so long, and like I think ultimately if this is the one time where I think that this is my time, then I am all well and good to just go out go out the way I do, and so on and so forth. So we ultimately have it to where Allison, John, and Nathan end up driving out to seemingly just find a place that will be able to take them to the place they need to go. So we ultimately have it to where John, Allison, and Nathan. So they end up driving. They end up driving and they end up going all out of their way to go to some airport, or they end up going to some place where a guy is just flying a plane. We end up having it to where John, Allison, and Nathan end up stopping this plane dead in its tracks, and we end up having the pilot end up coming out. The guy that I know from several freaking things at this point. He was in the movie Fight Club. He was in the show Blue Bloods. He was in a billion other freaking things at this point. Like he's been in seemingly everything. So we end up having, and heaven forbid, I actually know the guy's name, but I know he was in Fight Club. So we end up having it to where this guy gets out of the plane, and ultimately he's like, dude, I am at capacity with my plane. Like, I don't think I'll be able to get my plane up with all the weight of you people. Like, there's no way. We end up having it to where John is like, we have it to where the pilot is saying like, how much do you weigh? And John ultimately lies and he says he's like 180. It's like bullshit. He's like 105 or 205 210. And so like we have it to where there's bargaining and there's desperation and everything like that. And so you know what? It's like basically the point of just like F it. Like we'll just take these people. We'll just frickin' take them. Who cares? We'll just barely be able to skim by, but to get our freaking plane going. But at least we'll just get there. So, and ultimately, at some point, we end up having it to where like Allison ends up going with Nathan to go to this doctor that is going to try to give them as much insulin as humanly possible. And we end up having Allison end up thanking this nurse because it's like, good God, it's like we were just thinking that we were just going to get just barely by with insulin. But it seems like this nurse is giving them as much as humanly possible for them to just survive. So we end up having it to where ultimately this plane is just going so far seemingly north, I believe. Because ultimately we have it to where Dale is making a joke to Nathan about them basically going to the North Pole. To seemingly be protected by this whole thing. So we end up having it to ultimately this plane ends up going and I guess just runs out of fuel and ends up just having to have an emergency landing where they basically crash into this rock because ultimately the place of where they're landing is just not the best place to land, but they have to land anyways. We end up finding it that both pilots ending up dying, but it seems that everybody could get out of the plane safely. So we end up having it to where pushing on to have it to where ultimately John, Allison, and Nathan are going into this safe location, ultimately not telling anybody that Nathan has insulin or whatever. Just, hey man, just make it as long as you can. For however long. So they're ultimately going into this underground environment, and while that is going on, we end up having it to where the comets are dropping, or the whatever the thing is dropping, the comet or the meteor or whatever it is, the whatever things are dropping and crushing worlds and such. We end up having it to where ultimately they are scrambling to get down to this safe point, and ultimately it's just the near clutches of course it has to be like seconds before, so everybody has to rush down and fall over and trip because it's a disaster movie. So we end up having it to ultimately so John, Allison, and Nathan's character are all just like hugging it out because they're like, oh my God, we made it. And ultimately, we have Allison telling John that he loves her, and vice versa, because it's like, yeah, it's like we made it, but on top of that, it's like with all the problems that we've had, we'll just put that aside because ultimately, like like, hey, like, we put on our promise to ultimately have it to be that, like, this family is going to be safe. And so we end up finding out that, so these people have been down in this underground thing for supposedly 9 months. 9 months of this. So we end up finding it that eventually they have the all clear signal to eventually open up, because there's no radiation, there's no nuclear, whatever, there's no uh, there's no possibility of, it's all aftermath, it's all whatever. So we end up having it to be that there are seemingly birds flying around. There's life after this horrific moment. We end up kind of scanning through and ultimately showing you kind of the big uh, countries and or cities and or whatever that ultimately like have been completely and utterly annihilated supposedly by this event, showcasing places like Paris and all kinds of other lavish like environments that have now been crippled by this affecting this entire Earth, kind of showing like the entire globe as its kind of new and utterly decimated like environment. Like earlier, basically showcasing how like this thing like annihilated Florida and stuff like that in the early showings of this movie. So I thought that this movie was really like, there were some interesting moments in here. There were some little slivers of parts where I was like, okay, I think that this is kind of like interesting, like, but it just wasn't like one of those movies where like I feel like I haven't seen this kind of stuff before, or like it doesn't feel exactly fresh. Like, yeah, it's still an interesting story at bits and pieces, but as a whole, it kind of just feels like it's kind of like there has to be a slowing down of this movie. It can't just be like there had to have been some kind of loops and problems and issues to ultimately have this movie be stretched out. So ultimately, you couldn't have thought out that like things were going to happen easily and conveniently, that there had to be a real true struggle to get these people to survive. So with that, it kind of feels like a kind of a like an interesting movie, but then again, it also felt like a kind of predictable one as well. Like it kind of felt like I've seen this movie before, which I basically have. But anyways, that doesn't mean that it's a bad film. It just means that it could just be yet another one of these kinds of films that people might grow to like bits and pieces of it, but as a whole, uh, maybe just found it to just be like a killer of time or whatever for anybody. Just be like, oh, okay, hey, I saw this now. All right, cool. So that's all I wanted to say about this film, but I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.